Hey, how's it going? It's West Rico. Gonna be talking about the Second Amendment today, going over the history, my personal interpretation, other interpretations, refuting some interpretations, discussing why you should be a lawful gun owner, why you should stand up for your Second Amendment rights, and providing some statistical evidence of when the Second Amendment has been used against tyrannical government, how the Second Amendment should be used in terms of self-preservation and self-defense, and overall just supporting the argument for the preservation and strengthening of the Second Amendment. If you live in the United States, or if you even keep up with US politics from a foreign perspective, I'm sure you know that the Second Amendment is a widely argued and controversial provision. Some people will argue that the Second Amendment should be abolished, while simultaneously saying that only the government should have guns. Those same people generally call the government a dictatorship, say that the government oversteps our rights. Well, the Second Amendment is in place to defend our rights, to defend all the other amendments. And then you have the category that I largely fall into, where I think... No, I'm gonna backtrack. Then you have the category that think that you should only own like hunting rifles, bolt-action rifles, single shots, shotguns, etc. People who don't think that you should be able to own handguns readily, people that will attack the AR-15 and any other assault rifle or military-style rifles, even if they're designed for the civilian market in semi-auto. And this is generally the older crowd, I'd say, like the FUDs, the wine moms. And they get this information from the big media, usually MSNBC, or like The View, where they're talking about the AR-15 and the 5.56 caliber that shreds the deer meat that you can't even eat it. No, that's not true. First of all, the majority of gun-related homicides are committed with handguns. It's really only about 5%, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, that are committed with AR-15 style rifles. The only reason these rifles are so over-attacked is because of their use, or their proportionate use in mass shootings for more deaths, but more specifically public mass shootings, because that's all that big media likes to cover. That was a little bit of a tangent, didn't mean to take it there, but anyways, the third category is generally what I would align myself with. Second Amendment purists, people who believe that we should even strengthen the Second Amendment rights. Because at the end of the day, a criminal, a non-law abiding citizen, is not going to care about what they are legally allowed to be equipped with, what they are legally allowed to acquire. If they're going to use a gun for malicious intent, the least of their worries is breaking a full auto rule, or a magazine ban, or any sort of concealment, like restriction. They're not going to care. When you place quote-unquote common sense gun legislation, which some of it can be common sense, I'm not entirely anti-regulation. I do think in some instances, in some cases, I'm not against background checks. I think that's a smart practice. But I am against the quote-unquote common sense gun laws that can either get dealers or citizens who are just trying to buy a gun lawfully in big trouble. The NFA is a big one. I mean, this is a provision dating back to like the 1930s, which was aimed to prevent mobsters and gangsters from concealing shotguns, rifles, because they used to saw off the shotgun barrels. And the whole principle here, the whole idea was that if the feds caught, or they did like a raid and they found these short barrel shotguns being kept, then they could preemptively arrest said gangsters for like 10 years, maybe more. I don't know what the sentence was back then, but today, if you violate the NFA, it's generally like a $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. And all because you added a little stock to your pistol for a fun little range toy, and now it's an SBR, which is a violation of the NFA. Yeah, so revoke the NFA. They're actually trying to right now. PSA just launched a lawsuit in tandem with a bunch of pro-Second Amendment lobbyist groups to make a move towards ending the NFA. They did get suppressors removed, so that was a big one. There's no longer a $200 tax on suppressors, but if you do purchase and acquire a suppressor, I believe you're still logged into the registry. So, you know, at least one step in the right direction. Alright, now with that first little segment out the way, that's my viewpoints laid out, all my thoughts. We're going to move into the actual text itself of the Second Amendment, and I'm going to support the interpretation that the Second Amendment is indeed for self-defense, self-preservation, not just militia rights, or even hunting rights, as some people like to say. The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The anti-gun crowd really likes to harp on the militia part of that, the first clause, but the most important part is the second clause, or the last clause. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The right of the people. Now, yes, the militias were composed of people, of the people. They were state militias. The reason that we had state militias is because before the Constitution, there was no standing federal army. There was no federal entity. There was a centralized entity, but it wasn't really federal. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to raise or keep a standing army. So militias, state militias, employed by the people, for the people, were the militant and the peacekeeping force. They weren't super well organized. It was mostly like Minutemen. Some were organized, but they weren't organized in the way that a centralized military would be. We had militias because coming out of the war, off the tyranny of King George, the founders were precautious of tyrannical overreach. And so state militias served as a deterrence against the central government, which was very weak under the Articles. But still, these militias served as deterrents from tyrannical overreach. And the anti-gun crowd will argue tooth and nail that militias to protect from tyranny is the precipice of the Second Amendment. And it is, but simultaneously they will hold the point that self-defense was not a provision of the Second Amendment, was not the point. Self-defense absolutely was the point. Primarily self-defense from tyranny, but also self-defense from wrongdoers, from criminals, from other citizens who might impede on your own individual freedom. America was founded on individualism. If you don't have the right to defend your individuality, your individual freedom, then you don't have any rights at all. The age of the Founding Fathers is long gone. You cannot trust the government to reliably defend your rights for you. You need to arm yourself legally in order to defend your rights, not only from them, but once again, from other civilians who might impede on your rights, criminals who might impede on your rights. And like I said before, I pulled some documents that defend this point, so I'm going to go ahead and read those. This quote is commonly attributed to Jefferson, quoted in Jefferson's Commonplace book, but it's not entirely confirmed that he was the speaker. It reads, "Laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes." And that is paramount to what I was saying earlier. When you set in place all these gun restrictions, criminals are not going to care. They're not going to give a shit. They're going to do shit far worse that are going to land them far worse consequences than violating some NFA law or some little gun law. In Thomas Paine's Thoughts on Defense of War, 1775, he said, "The peaceable part of mankind will be continually overrun by the vile and abandoned, while they neglect the means of self-defense. Horrid mischief would ensue were one half of the world deprived of the use of arms." If we apply this to a modern context, Paine is essentially saying that you need to have an armed, peaceable population, so in our case, your day-to-day citizens, to control the criminally charged population who might be using their guns for no good. When you restrict and deprive the civilians of their right to bear arms, you're essentially submitting them to the will and the mercy of criminals who do not give a shit about the restrictions and regulations. There's definitely something to be said that the argument that armed civilians are necessary to prevent society from being overrun with criminals definitely holds up better in the context of the late 1700s, when there wasn't a readily established and organized police force. But even today, studies have shown that concealed carriers are statistically better at stopping active shooters in non-gun-free zones than the police are. Or at least armed citizens stop a higher percentage. I don't know if they stop them better. This is according to the Crime Prevention Research Center. I'll try to link any sources that I've been referencing throughout the video in the description. But if these documents don't seal the argument that the Second Amendment is about more than just protection from tyranny, but also individual self-defense, allow me to cite U.S. v. Heller, 2010. District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008, was a Supreme Court case that was launched by citizens, or residents rather, of Washington, D.C., who challenged the restrictive gun laws. At the time, in D.C., in order to legally possess your firearm within your home, it had to be disassembled, unloaded, and on top of that, it had to be trigger-locked. Now let's stick with the idea that the Second Amendment is solely for militia use to prevent against tyrannical government. If this is the sole purpose, even if this is the sole purpose, because we're still answering that question, how are you supposed to readily use your firearm to prevent tyranny, or to combat the feds, if it is disassembled, unloaded, and trigger-locked? Now, that's not as bad, because likely you're not going to be defending your home from the feds. You might, if it comes down to that. I hope not. Never know, Ruby Ridge. But if you're using your firearm for its intended purpose of self-defense, as this case defines, then you cannot reliably access your firearm unless you know how to do a hell of a field assembly in quick enough time for self-preservation use. If my firearm is trigger-locked, I have to unlock said lock. I would have to reassemble the gun and then load it. I'm not sure if it meant that the magazine couldn't be in the gun, or if it meant that magazines had to be unloaded. If it meant that magazines had to be unloaded, you're adding even more time, unless you have a wheel gun, or you're just going to drop one in the chamber. The court ruled in a 5-4 decision in favor of Heller, in favor of the citizens of D.C., that this law was unconstitutional. In doing so, through their interpretation, they affirmed that the Second Amendment was indeed for self-defense. The provisions of the Second Amendment applied not only to militia use, not only to prevention of tyranny, but for individual self and home preservation. And so whether or not the supporting documents from the founders swayed you, this case constitutionally affirmed that the Second Amendment is indeed for self-defense. District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008. Do your own research. Look it up for yourself. I'll link a source for it in the description. Okay, so now I have laid out my viewpoints for the Second Amendment. I have covered some of the other viewpoints you'll hear in the talking space. Now I want to address the idea that in modern day America, we cannot reliably use our firearms against tyrannical government. A big argument that I'll hear all the time, or at least talking point, is, well, nowadays the government has tanks and planes and a lot more manpower. How can we with semi-auto rifles stand up to the government? Well, let me introduce you to the Bundy standoff, 2014. I'm not going to give a full account of the events that occurred, but for a little bit of a breakdown, Cliven Bundy, a Nevada farmer, had been grazing on federal lands since 1993, refusing to pay grazing fees. And in 2014, he owed over $1 million in unpaid fines. Bundy claimed that his family had been grazing that land since the 1870s, so he rejected federal authority that it was federal lands, and in return, the Bureau of Land Management started to impound his cattle. They were basically stealing his cattle as punishment for his avoidance of the fines. So Bundy gathered people from all over, a big right-wing crowd, mostly libertarians, some Republicans, or really just people who wanted to stand up to the Fed. And they came from all over with their guns, and they engaged in a standoff with the Feds. BLM and the Feds eventually backed down, and whether Bundy was in the right or not, I'm not going to comment on, but he effectively used firearm brandishing through this standoff and the Second Amendment to deter the Feds from their excessive fines, from their repossession of his cattle. And this is a quintessential case of the common man standing up against the federal government with guns in modern America and winning. Now, I will say, if the Feds really wanted to, they could have Waco'd this shit, they could have Ruby Ridged this shit, they could have demolished Bundy and his massive crowd, but that would have been a horrible look for the Feds. And yes, it's not unheard of for the Feds to kill people. It's not unheard of for the Feds to fire on civilians like this, but they wouldn't have fired on a crowd like this. This would have been a bloodbath. Both sides armed to the teeth. Honestly, if the Feds wanted to, this shit could have looked like Tiananmen Square, but once again, that's too much of a big publicity PR nightmare that just they would have never recovered from. So once again, to recap, this is a prime example of civilians using their Second Amendment rights to deter and win against federal government. Alright, so now we've defined that the Second Amendment is indeed for self-defense, not just militia use. We've established that you can indeed still stand up to tyrannical government even in the modern age. Now, just going over some blanket stats as to why you should own a gun. God created men, Samuel Colt made them equal. Firearms are the great equalizer. There is no better tool for self-defense or self-preservation. I recommend you get a carry gun, but at the very least, if you care about your family safety, your own home safety, private safety, you should at the very least get a shotgun for private home defense. Many of these are domestic disputes. People just get super heated and resort to violence. Be smart about your ownership. Be smart about if your firearm is easily accessible to children in the house. Make sure it's not. You want your weapons to be readily available for self-defense use, but if you do have children, just make sure you're safe with your storage. If you do have children, teach them the fundamentals of firearm safety as well as proper handling. This will dramatically decrease any sort of chance of any negligent discharge. 29 states in the Union have adopted constitutional carry, otherwise known as permitless carry. You do not need a CWP in order to legally conceal carry. So long as you're over 18, you're free to do so. Definitely look up your state's laws before you make any advance on this. But I'm a big advocate for everyone who is in a good mental space to trust themselves with a firearm, anyone who is legally able to acquire a firearm, and especially women. Around 60% of all violent crime occurring against men, but women are generally seen as an easier target, and 90% of all sexual assault and rape cases are against women. It's something you can keep in your purse, something you can keep easily in your waistline. That goes for everyone. That's all I got. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed. Do your own research. Never trust the government. Buy a gun if you can. Be smart with your gun ownership, and until next time, take care.